Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Overmo. I'm the Strategic Plan Coordinator for the State Bar of South Dakota. I just want to give you a few housekeeping items before we get started today. The presentation will last approximately 45 minutes. We try to leave some time for Q&A. And then you will have an opportunity to submit those questions to today's presenter by typing your question into the question pane on the control panel. So you may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect all of them and address them at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Tutman to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am chair of the in-house committee, and we are very pleased to offer one of our own, Julie Johnson, who is an attorney and a registered lobbyist. Every year for the past few years, Julie gives a wonderful summary of what the legislator has done and a nice review of the laws from a lawyer's perspective. And we thought it would be good to open it up to other people at the bar. So thank you very much, Julie. And she has got a wonderful presentation ready, but I will chime in from time to time. And if you have questions, like Beth said, please put them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end. So thank you all for joining, and I will turn it over to Julie.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. This is Julie Johnson. Thank you for joining us today. Let me show you a little bit about what we'll do. I've done the legislature for a whole lot of years. If I told you how many years, you'd know exactly how old I am. So I don't know how not to do this, but I'm also very sensitive to how at the end of the legislative session, people like yourselves need to know all kinds of little nuts and bolts about what the legislature did, whether it's the kind of thing that captures the headlines during session or not. But there's lots of things that our clients, especially business-related clients, need to know at the end of the day. So I created a little outline about what we'll talk about. Of course, it wouldn't be a good lawyer presentation if I didn't offer a few disclaimers. I'll share with you some dates. I'll give you some things to look forward to, beginning with the end in mind. Share with you some thoughts about how the legislature began that we may be able to see into the future. Then I'll share some budget, some regulatory, economic development, workforce, HR and employment law, a few other nice to know items, and then what we did on veto day as we segued to COVID-19, and then we'll show you some ballot measures. And of course, we do want to be sure we have plenty of time for your questions. You do need to know I do not represent the state bar. Most of the issues here are probably not ones in which the bar actually had a position, but just be aware I don't represent the state bar. My clients create a kind of a mishmash of interest areas that become influential in the workplace. So the viewpoint I bring to all this is workplace related issues and an in-house counsel related perspective. There may be some other issues that you may run into as well. Notice I'm not an expert on all of these issues. There's some that I'm too much of an expert on, but others that I am not. I kind of organize them in strange ways. How I slice and dice the issues may not be the same way that you slice and dice the issues. So bear with me in terms of how I organize these thoughts. Notice there'll probably be a special legislative session in June on a date yet to be determined. That may change all of this. There's a lot of things that could go away if it's determined that something the legislature did when they went home in March may cost too much in the current state of the economy. That could go away or have a delayed implementation date or whatever. So be aware that much may change after that. And I've put the link to the legislature's website on this particular page for those of you who don't spend as much time living on that website as some of us do. Let me bring a couple of dates to your attention as well. In your roles, we do need to keep our eye on these, and that begins with the primary election on June 2. There are many legislative races that will be decided on June 2 that are all single party candidates and do not have opponents in the fall. So this one is even more important than sometimes might be considered. There'll be a special legislative session on a date yet to be decided in June I inquired of both the Legislative Research Council and the governor's office yesterday. No date has yet been determined. There's a lot of moving parts. But that would bring us to the November 3rd general election, where some of these issues, well, we'll officially elect legislators and we'll determine a few ballot questions as well. The legislative process kicks off again right away. December 1 this year would be the governor's budget address, which starts the whole play over button every year. And of course, that one might be very interesting this year. Then next year again, we'll be back at the legislature again, beginning on January 12th. The legislature did adopt a 37-day legislative session for next year, when the main run of the session would be over on March 11th, and then they would hold their veto day on March 29th of next year. So we also need, in this profession, we need to keep our eye on who's running, which members of our profession are stepping up, etc. Notice that there are 6 senators who are termed out. In other words, don't have any more eligibility to run for the Senate seat. And then there are 8 members of the House of Representatives that are termed out. There are a couple that are trying to flip from one house to the next in these upcoming elections. In the Senate, there are 5 lawyers running, if my count is correct, including 2 who are hoping to flip over to the Senate from the House. And unusually enough, this year, we have 1 law student running for the Senate. In the House, if my count is correct, there are 5 lawyers running, including a former legislator lawyer who is hoping to return. Obviously, we have had a tragedy in the legislature this year. Representative Glanzer passed away, I believe due to COVID-19, and that has created a vacancy in the House. How that is handled is yet to be determined. Notice also this year there are a few independents running. So it's not all Republicans and all Democrats as candidates. So why do we care? Well, there's a lot of workplaces. A lot of you play the role of encouraging your coworkers, your staff, your team members, etc., to vote, to register to vote and to vote. And a lot of workplace registration efforts take place every year. A lot of time off to vote that gets arranged every year. So keep your eye on this. There were some city and school elections that are typically April elections that are being moved to June, courtesy of legislation passed on veto day. So some of those are moved to June too with the primary election. And then I noticed one other that's moved later in June. So be sure you calibrate all of that with your local community for those of you who facilitate those in your workplaces. Absentee voting is going to be hugely encouraged this year for a lot of reasons, including COVID-19. But notice that the deadline to request an absentee ballot is June 1 at 5:00 p.m. Voter registration, remote voter registration is also being encouraged this year. The last day to register to vote for the primary this year is May 18th at 5:00 p.m. Now, the Secretary of State's office has begun quite a process of sending out absentee ballot requests and or voter registration. I have not gotten mine in the mail yet, so I can't testify that this is how it looks, but I did interact a couple of times the last few days with the Secretary of State's office. I have put the link from their website on this particular slide in the event that it is helpful to all of you. The other thing that may be different in terms of voting, and those of you who encourage voting in your workplace, is that polling places may change due to the virus outbreak. Okay, let's see if I can, there we go. So how did the legislature begin? Well, there's a couple of trend lines that you may want to keep in mind, and that we may see them play out later, or we may hope to see them play out later. One is that the governor declared South Dakota open for business. That was one of her key sound bites, and that captured national headlines. So here's hoping in the future that those of us who need the legislature to help with these kinds of issues from time to time can also use that tagline in the future. Also, there was an invitation to help find the next big idea for South Dakota. That was repeated several times on certain pieces of legislation. Let's hope we are still pursuing that in our future as we come out of this virus. A lot of attention to hemp, making it legal in South Dakota, and then being sure that a system that regulates hemp is effectively in place and has the money to pay for that system. There were a lot of vehicle bills, or placeholder bills, I would call them, that just had a title, that they were introduced for the possibility of some kind of agreement or some grand design later. Almost none of those were used this year. Notice also that the legislature had a bit of a new electronic system this year, which became a bit of an extra challenge for those of us who've done this for a long time. It really wasn't that much different, but yet it was. For the public to know how to use it without enough training, et cetera, it became very challenging. Yet they made their way through it. sdlegislature.gov is their website. The staff there has worked very hard of late to be sure that it's a system that works well for all of its users, not just legislators. That was their primary concern going into it. The rest of us users really were not their primary concern, but they are inviting input on that. So if any of you found some glitches there, we've been invited to provide that kind of input to them so they can get over those glitches and those nuances that come from people like you and I using their system in other ways. Notice also that the legislature is getting a new executive director. Fortunately, it's a person who worked there before, is coming back to South Dakota from Kansas. So that produces some different effects there as well. There was a lot of unity at the legislature about being sure there was an increase for K-12, Medicaid providers, and employees. There's a bit of a trend toward those who want full-time positions as legislators. That scares me to death, to be real honest with you. There were 7 new legislators in place at this particular legislative session, but the new legislators did a very nice job, so I was impressed. Be aware then that they did create a 37-day legislative session for next year. So to touch on where we started out budget-wise, I will make this relevant here in a minute, I promise. The governor's budget really had 0% increases for almost nothing, but with a few special appropriations proposals from the governor. After that, they found a few general fund increases for both the current fiscal year and next fiscal year, which led them to some budget agreements in the final days. All of that is up for renegotiations. But the budget issues that you and I might care about, one takeaway is that there are no tax increases in this budget whatsoever. There's very few small fee increases, very few. That could change, of course. For those of you who help keep your eye on the property tax bill for your entities, the property tax bill should be just about the same in terms of the special ed and general fund levies for education. Special ed is going up. General education fund levies are coming down, but at the end of the day, they should be about equal. So in terms of property taxes that go to support education, things should be just about the same. For those of us that have found a real value in a service that we now know as Helpline Center or statewide 211, and that's become incredibly important during COVID-19. That was funded statewide at this legislative session, and for a lot of reasons, I'm hoping that that one stays when they come back for their special session. State employee salaries, some of us calibrate our salary increases based on state employee salary increases. They were awarded at a 2% rate, but I think that is a giant maybe given the special session and the impact on the budget. One other thing that you and I might want to know about going forward, you may want to keep your eye out on audits from the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue was given several new FTEs to watch out for remote sellers. That's the internet sales tax essentially. So if you have clients that are in that realm, you'll want to know the Department of Revenue is beefing up their operations there. Also, all county sales tax bills died. There were a few that were proposed. All of them went to heaven, as they usually do. Notice also what could become relevant in your places in the future is what was previously known as the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is now known as the Reemployment Assistance Fund. It was healthy when we left Pier. It could get whacked rather significantly based on the virus, although there's some federal funds involved there as well. So we'll keep an eye out on that balance because that could result in reemployment assistance tax increases. All of this is subject to change with a special session. A couple of others, budget headlines for business. Broadband connectivity. The governor asked for a $5 million special appropriation to expand broadband connectivity into some severely underserved parts of South Dakota. They did the same thing last year. That leveraged a lot of federal money and a lot of broadband investment. With all of the healthcare challenges we've faced in the last couple of months, it could be that that is even more critical than it was before. Some of us are in parts of the state where our state radio coverage is a little weak. They did allocate $5.1 million for state radio upgrades. We'll see if that sticks after the special session. For those of us that work with our cities or counties or townships, there was a new loan program created for cities, counties, and townships to cover their emergency costs while they await the federal dollars. Also, bioprocessing, a $1 million special appropriation was made for a bioprocessing partnership between South Dakota State and South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. A lot yet to be defined there, but that could bring on a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship there as well. Also, at the end of the session, they did agree to appropriate $4.1 million in general funds for county and township roads. Now, that has never been done. I think that's a fairly straightforward statement. They have never appropriated general funds for roads, but in this case, they did. So those of you who represent counties and townships or contractors, et cetera, they did allocate those funds to match federal dollars that were coming down for county and township road needs. We'll see if that sticks after the special session as well. USD needed a new health science building, and that included a $5 million special appropriation for that. Dakota State University got a special appropriation for cybersecurity and entrepreneurship, a center they have there. If you are interested in those realms, you may want to be in contact with Dakota State. Their presentation was rather remarkable in front of the committee. And then, of course, the other, they call them the big three. I don't like to think of them that way, but K-12, state employee salaries, Medicaid providers all got a 2% increase. But then they made a special $8.9 million appropriation for special education increases. Higher education got very little beyond what they had today. And then, of course, the regulation and administration of the hemp bill was funded. But all this could be subject to change on a special legislative session. I also look at the world in terms of economic development related issues at the legislature. As I mentioned, industrial hemp passed after 2 years worth of work by a lot of people. That's House Bill 1008. Notice if you care about that bill and you haven't committed it to memory yet, it does have an emergency clause on it. And the state is busy trying to get the federal approvals to move forward as well. So there'll be much more left to note, but that one became effective the day it was signed. Another one which streamlines zoning, Senate Bill 157. If you are working with your company to develop a new project and you need a zoning permit to do that, you'll want to reread Senate Bill 157. It streamlines the process, changes the voting requirements on the local level, etc. So be sure and pull that one up if you are in some phase of needing a zoning permit. Also, I mentioned the rural broadband connection. We'll see that roll out, I'm sure, after we get through COVID-19. We talked about bioprocessing and state radio and a few of these. The next one that we haven't mentioned is Deadwood's hope to be the situs for sports betting, legal sports betting. And I see there's a typo there, my apologies. What the legislature did was to put that on the ballot. The money from that would be dedicated to historic preservation, just as the other Deadwood funds are today. Also announced in the middle of the legislative session was a proposal that the Board of Economic Development would open up the READY Fund, which is their economic development, revolving economic development initiative fund, for housing, not single family housing, but other housing proposals. That was playing out kind of on the sidelines during the legislative session. I was deeply involved in that. If you want to know where they're taking that and you want more dialogue, feel free to contact me. I had specific clients involved in that issue, and I came to learn that a little too well. They have really not rolled that out yet because of COVID-19 and some other projects that the Governor's Office of Economic Development is using. It may be something that you and some of your clients are interested in, it may not be. Riot boosting from the last legislative session was clarified in House Bill 1117. If you need to know that, if you're involved in a project with your company or others, you'll want to reread the language of House Bill 1117. And then for those of you who are also working to be sure your housing stock in your community meets your economic development needs, you'll be heartened to know that the South Dakota Housing Development Authority was granted more FTEs to support what is called a Dakotaplex project, which is a way of, it's kind of a different iteration on the Governor's House projects, where they put 2 or 3 or 4 such units together to create a multiple family environment. A couple of other economic development tools that are worth talking about. The tax increment finance mechanism, there was a bill, House Bill 1260. It really doesn't change anything. It just changes what needs to come with the application when it is filed with other local government entities. So thankfully, we were able to keep that one just to that purpose of the bill. I worry about those bills, especially for groups that don't use them on a regular basis. Discretionary formula is another important economic development tool. One of the only others that local governments have. House Bill 1259. This reorganizes all of those statutes. And so you will find, if you are using the discretionary formula in your county, you will find some of these section numbers in different places in the code. Now, there's also a 5-year savings clause on the bill, so you do not have to go back into ordinances and those kinds of documents. If you'd already established a discretionary formula in the past, you don't have to go in and change all those statutory citations. So be aware, 1259, some of those statutes move to different places. It probably is a better alignment of where they belong in the code. Now, also a bill that the bar did support creates series limited liability companies, modernize that part of our code. That's House Bill 1179. You have a client that may be able to use that. You'll want to pull up 1179. You do business in and around Ellsworth Air Force Base, you'll want to be aware of a task force that will probably be created called the Ellsworth Legislative Task Force, created in a concurrent resolution. So it really doesn't have the force and effect of law, but yet there's a lot of commitment to making that happen to see what else needs to be done to support Ellsworth Air Force Base. Notice also if you or your clients had loans or bonds with the Value Added Ag Finance Authority, all of that is moving to the Economic Development Finance Authority and the Board of Economic Development through Senate Bill 45. So the Value Added Ag Finance Authority goes away. Actually, they moved some of that last year, but the legislative cleanup for that was in Senate Bill 45. Environmental projects and their performance bonds are enhanced due to Senate Bills 1025 and 1026. So if you're in the environmental project universe, pay attention to those as well. If you're curious about other economic development or community development funds and their availability through the state, essentially, the answer is at the end of the day that all of them were intact. None of them were robbed, so to speak, which is a concern I always have, to balance the budget. So the Futures Fund, Ready, Building South Dakota, the Omnibus Water Bill, Housing Opportunity Fund, and Workforce Education Fund are all intact and available. And let's hope it stays that way after the June special session. And even tech schools got equipment money. So workforce issues, driver's licenses in Spanish, that did finally pass effective January 1, 2021. That's Senate Bill 70. If you are helping your workforce with driver's licensing, you'll want to become familiar with Senate Bill 70. If you are not already, this will have to be implemented by the Department of Public Safety, and we are awaiting guidance from them. The tech institutes will all be called technical colleges. If you have a scholarship in one of them or whatever, you may be getting paperwork that asks for name changes, etc. Just be aware of that. Their marketing may change as well. For those of you who were encouraging workforce enhancements such as dual credit, that stayed mostly the same. There was some legislative scrutiny, but Senate Bill 142 just changed what happens if you get a failing grade in a dual credit course, you're retaking it, and says that it can't be used for remedial education. Notice also the legislature recommitted its commitment to rural health recruitment, which is a tuition reimbursement for rural health providers committing to serve rural communities after graduation. So that financial commitment remains. I think I mentioned the Housing Development Authority. Before all of this, also, the Department of Labor's budget was down by 3 FTEs in field operations, which meant local offices. We'll see if it stays that way after COVID-19. The legislature also made quite a commitment to rural veterinary medicine education by a special appropriation in 1227. And then there were some occupational licensing bills that the administration put together, clean up some little encumbrances and unnecessary burdens in various occupational licensures in the Department of Labor and Regulation. By the way, there's a footnote there from me at least. I represent some clients who have been bringing forth ideas that need to be cleaned up in that realm. If you have stumbled into some of those little barriers to entrance of certain occupations and licensing from the state, this may be a good time to have a receptive administration to get some of those cleaned up. You could send them to me. We could talk about them, see how we could advance those issues. Other workforce issues, notice if you are in the realm of having a unionized workforce, you'll want to know that collective bargaining is banned now for higher education. So there will not be collective bargaining in the public colleges. Also, mental health, the legislature had an extensive interim process, made several recommendations. Essentially, I believe at the end of the day, you can say that most of their recommendations were adopted, including the ability to deliver those services by telehealth. And one of their other key recommendations was to take the 211 service statewide, which I think has been more than demonstrated. Veterans tuition at technical colleges was clarified in House Bill 1069. This is an interesting one. 14 to 18-year-old driver's licenses. This area of the law was cleaned up and requires a little more experience. You have anybody on your payroll that is driving for you, or you need a driver's license for them in those age groups, read Senate Bill 113. Also, there was considerable attention to post-traumatic stress disorder among our first responder communities. They wanted to be sure that workers' comp covers that. There'll probably be a study on that topic. Also, a bill that has commonly become known as Check the Box, 1185, a national trend, did die. The Uniform Power of Attorney Act did pass after a rocky start last year, Senate Bill 148. So if you need powers of attorney for various things or et cetera, be sure to get current with Senate Bill 148, and the Bar Association was deeply involved in that bill. Notice also, if you are watching salaries around you as you try to calibrate your own salaries, the targeted teacher salary was set at $51,367.47. You may want to keep your eye on that. Okay. A couple of other HR or employment law issues. The governor introduced a parental leave law for state employees only, Senate Bill 186. That bill did pass. There is no other mandate to other employers, but be aware that that did happen. And I guess I just touched on the other two issues on that slide. A couple of other issues I will call corporate issues. Series LLCs, I probably mentioned that. Is House Bill 1179. We mentioned the Uniform Power of Attorney Act, Senate Bill 148. Landlord-tenant rights were revised in House Bill 1168. A few revisions were made in the LLC Act in House Bills 1108 and 1109. House Bill 1114 allowed certain abbreviations to be used for professional corporations, professional limited liability companies, etc. So those abbreviations are sanctioned. Also, shareholders can participate by remote access, such as we're doing today, allowed by House Bill 1113. Another one has become known as drive-by disability complaints. A process was adopted for South Dakota's businesses impacted by random ADA complaints that become known as drive-by complaints. So Senate Bill 140 addresses this area of the law, and they went with a piece of legislation very similar to what Ohio used, 140. Few other regulatory issues. Because of some other issues that went on in Pierce, some of these may have flown below the radar, but some of you may need to know these. Enhanced texting ban. As you remember, a few years ago when the state did increase the gas tax to create a better funding formula for roads in South Dakota, there was a texting ban as a part of that package. That was incredibly enhanced this year, and House Bill 1169 extends to social media but has certain exceptions. So you'll want to take a look at it in the context of what it means for your employment policies in your workplace, et cetera. And you certainly don't have enough to do right now with COVID-19 in your employment policies, I'm sure. But as you have them open and are working on them for those purposes, look at 1169 and see if you need to make some changes there as well. Another one that may have been a little understated was tribal identification. This had been an issue for the last few years. In Senate Bill 146, the agreement was tribal identification would be accepted, would be valid for all forms of commerce. So you may need to wrap your head around that in your workplace to see how that affects how you do business. It was also validated for marriage license applications in House Bill 1097. So a major agreement was finally made after several years on this same subject. Liquidated court costs go up slightly from $40 to $50 if you need to factor that in. Also, a cleanup was made in the interception of communication orders, mostly for law enforcement, Senate Bill 71. Another bill, Uniform Civil Remedies for Unauthorized Disclosure of Intimate Images Act, House Bill 1108, did pass, and a few changes in the Uniform LLC Act in 1109. A few things that may be nice to know in your offices. The Department of Tourism ended the session with extra dollars, mostly to align with the tourism promotion tax revenues. This could change quite a bit. You may have clients or your workplaces may be deeply connected to the visitor industry in South Dakota. We'll see if the legislature keeps any extra revenue with tourism if they are looking for more revenue. But this may be a year where they really do need to be sure they can rebuild some of those tax revenues to the hospitality industry. Some of you also sponsor hunts or use hunts as ways of caring for your clients, etc. There was a change in the non-resident migratory waterfowl season. It went from one 10-day season to 2 5-day seasons in Senate Bill 150. And then the other one that may be relevant in cases where you are inviting others to join you to enjoy the outdoors, to fish or hunt, there's a new habitat stamp added, which is $10 for residents, $25 for non-residents. And those dollars can be used for habitat, public access, or aquatic habitat. So then we get done with all of that and immediately turn to COVID-19 on veto day. That meeting that day was held for the first time electronically. The legislature had never met electronically before. They have done a lot of video hearings and telephone testimony, et cetera, over time. But the entire meeting was done by a software package known as Microsoft Teams. It seemed to work fairly well. We'll see where they go with that kind of technology into the future. It did change the interaction of the public considerably. But a couple of pieces of that you may want to know: the Small Business Disaster Relief Sub Fund was created by Senate Bill 192. There is a link on the Economic Development website. It's hard to find if you don't know what you're looking for. So I put the link there if you have a business. It's from $5,000 to $75,000 that may be a business or a nonprofit, by the way, that may need some relief funding during this period of time. It's a 0% interest rate. You may want to access that. Also, Senate Bill 190 did allow the state to extend driver's licenses and CDLs during emergencies such as this. And you've seen executive orders now that have done that as well. That's Senate Bill 190. Senate Bill 187 was the one that created some of the rules around the new reemployment assistance effort that's going on in this time of emergency. The other thing that you may want to know is what's the link to the governor's executive orders. Those are hard to find if you don't know where to look for them. I included the link that is easier to access on the covid.sd.gov website. You may need some of the exact language because some of the recent executive orders are specific to certain professional licensures, etc. And then special session. We don't know the date, but we do know that budget will be front and center. They need the time to know what the federal expenses, what the federally created funds will do. Will they absorb some of the state's losses? We'll have to see what the revenues will do. There'll also be a lot of considerations about what we can live without. And in my opinion, all bets are off. So that's in June. We don't know the date. Ballot measures in 2020. Amendment B is the sports wagering ballot measure. That is the one I mentioned for Deadwood. It's well written, brought forth by Deadwood, and this fills the gap created by the U.S. Supreme Court when they said that states could allow sports wagering. Also, two marijuana-related ballot measures. Legalizing marijuana for medical use is initiated measure 17, and then regulating, legalizing, and taxing marijuana and passing laws regarding hemp is Amendment A. So you'll see those on the November general election ballot. I have exceeded my time. I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. And that's my contact information. What kind of questions are out there?
Yes, thank you, Julie. That was a great overview. I hope other people learned as much as I did. And Beth, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. Have you received anything?
There are no questions.
So I will ask one, Julie, of all the things you discussed, which one do you think it has the most impact on attorneys in the state bar?
Oh, the most impact. Well, let's see. There's probably a handful of them. The Power of Attorney Act probably does. It's probably very below the radar. The LLC bills probably do. Those two are a little below the radar. The texting ban, a lot of us will need to know what's in or out of the texting ban. And a lot of workplaces will need to be sure their policies and procedures are updated for it. So those are the ones that come to mind right off the top, but that's only my perspective.
No, I think that's helpful. I think that power of attorney one is one that a lot of folks might not pick up on. And I personally, I love the series LLC legislation. I think it is useful for corporate formation.
Even though, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge economic development bill.
Yes, I do too. And I hope that we see, and I know the attorneys who pushed it through coming, I think it's the business law group, but that is it's a really important step.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And the more we can help people understand that, the better off we'll be.
Absolutely.
Nice work, business law committee.
Yeah, very nice work. Did anything surprise you about the legislative session this year?
Just COVID-19.
and anything
electronically at the end is pretty amazing. Because you got legislators that barely use technology.
Right.
and here they are all meeting electronically. So it's a pretty giant leap.
That's true. Do you think that'll continue into next year? Do you think we'll see any more kind of technology use or changes in how senators and representatives vote?
Well, I do hope we don't go to all electronic meetings. The citizen input, the experts' input is not handled efficiently. in my opinion, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we're able to do next year and how things how this COVID-19 kind of wraps up a little bit. Any last remarks you'd like to give? Folks, if you who are on the line, I know you're all muted. If you have any questions, feel free to chat in or reach out to Julie. She's got a wealth of experience and knowledge in this area, and she really knows this discussion. So feel free to reach out to her. And thanks, Julie, for presenting today.
Thanks. I'm grateful to all of you. Have a wonderful day. Oh, it's Happy Law Day, by the way.
Yeah. It's a good day to have it. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too.